We'll be talking about JavaScript on the back end. I'm sure this is a topic you've already heard a lot about, and I'm sure you already know a lot about JavaScript in general. So we will mostly focus on the practical things and on theoretically only the things you bare minimum need to create something with JavaScript and Node.js on the back end. So hopefully it won't be boring like in university. But we won't be talking about that too much because we have her here. So yeah, do you have any questions before we start? As in, how far along are you in the learning process with JavaScript? If you have any experience with JavaScript, feel free to just raise your hand and tell us about it. If not, I mean, it's totally fine. We're going to go through all the basics from the bare minimum, so it's going to be totally fine if you have absolutely no experience at all. So, yeah, nice. We have absolutely no experience with JavaScript. That's great. What do you do in school? Like C# or C? C, just C.
Yes, we do have experience in JavaScript. We did web.
Oh, okay. So you have basics in web, right? Okay. Okay, great. So this is going to be very interesting then for you. And just a side note, I'm very happy to see that you were able to come here. Like, there's a lot of people here, so great that you're interested. And the next hour or so is going to be kind of hardcore. So feel free to follow along. If you have any questions that are very on point with the topic I'm explaining at the moment, feel free to just stop me immediately so we can go through that more. If you have a question that's more general, wait until the Q&A session at the end so we can go through it in more detail, okay? Does that sound good? If you have any questions, you could just like wave at me or just be like really obnoxious and just shout. But yeah. Okay, cool. Yeah, let's go. So just a few words about myself. Thanks for your professor for introducing me. Very short notice. This is, by the way, the best and worst picture of myself that I have. So yeah, let's not talk about that anymore. But yeah, I'm one of the founders at Bookvar. We're doing online education. And my colleague, Amra, hi Amra, she's recording this. And this will be live for other colleagues to see. I think tomorrow, right? Or tonight, yeah. So it's going to be live on YouTube, so you can check this out if you want to recap. And I'm also a teacher at the Academy, 387. I've been doing that for quite a while, so if you want like to listen to some courses, you can just Google me and this will pop up. Except for that, I also do a lot of teaching and writing online on Medium and PactPub, etc., etc. So you can find me if you need anything. You can just message me on either Twitter or whatever. And just another thing. To keep you in your seats until the end, there will be a free coupon giveaway for a bunch of courses on Bookvar. So don't go anywhere. You'll have to sit here for an hour, but you'll still learn something, okay? Okay, so let's move on to the actual stuff at hand. Do you feel like this? I feel like this all the time. Yeah, I mean, I hope you understand that this is a joke, like this is a meme. Okay, we got that. Okay, we got that. So. I don't usually sit like this. No. Sometimes. But yeah, this is what my usual day looks like. I sit and write code half the day, and the half of the other day I don't do anything because I'm lazy. But let's not go into that in too much detail. What we want to learn is how to do this, how to write JavaScript on the back end, how to write server-side code that you're usually writing in C or C++ or, God forbid, PHP or whatever. Like, you want to write that in JavaScript, okay? And that's what we will be talking about today. Stop laughing. Okay. Or you can actually laugh a bit. It's fine. So what we're going to do today is going to be quite literally writing JavaScript on the server side. So I have a little snippet of JavaScript here that you can not at all see because this projector is freaking tiny. But what it says is it's a simple AJAX request, a simple HTTP request to request some data from a server, right? And we're kind of used to this with JavaScript. If you've done anything on the client side in the browser with HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, the basics, you have, I mean, for sure, done an HTTP request or created an HTTP request. And we want to know how to utilize all that code we're used to writing in the browser and write the same code, but on the server side. And that's amazing, because we don't have to switch languages by switching what we're writing, okay? Okay, so you're following so far, okay? We want to write JavaScript, the same JavaScript we're used to writing in the browser, but we want to do the same stuff on the back end, on the server, okay? Just to note, how many of you know what JavaScript is? How many of you don't know? I'm kidding, no. So it's basically a C-based language. It's the pretty much exact same as Java, but better. It's maybe not better, but it's cooler. It's cooler. Okay. So let's go through the agenda, what we will be doing. We will mostly focus on the pure basics. We will touch upon some tools you need to learn to use JavaScript in production, and you will have to learn about basic patterns and paradigms. You already know about paradigms from school. You know about object-oriented programming, about functional programming. You most surely know about MVC. You know about MVC, right? Please tell me you learn MVC. You do learn MVC, right? You do? Okay, good. I saw one guy nodding, so I'm going to say everything is good. So MVC is very important. Both object-oriented and functional programming are important in JavaScript because as a language, it kind of has everything all together. So that's both bad and very, very good. And I'm going to show you why it's good and kind of forget about the bad stuff because you don't want to use the bad stuff. Okay. Just to go through the agenda in real detail, because we're going to be here for an hour, so we don't get lost in what we're doing. The first couple of slides are going to be mainly about just JavaScript as a language, just the bare basics, what it does, how it works. Then we're moving on to Node, and Node.js is a framework for JavaScript on the server. It's very simple. And the basics of Node, they work by using frameworks and modules. And modules are just snippets of code that are reusable. And that's the basic structure of how we use JavaScript with Node. Frameworks and modules, okay? After that, we're going to have a really short demo. Hopefully, you have Node installed on these machines and you can follow along. If not, I mean, it doesn't really matter. We can just follow along on my machine, totally fine. Some of you have laptops. That's amazing because you can go ahead and install it on the laptops. Well, I mean, we have time for that, so no worries. After the demo, then the real fun starts. Okay, we're gonna start by learning about more about APIs and ORMs and what tools you need to use to kind of start using Node seriously in production. And once we finish that, we're going to take a look at the patterns and paradigms and why and how you use the patterns and which paradigms you use when you code in JavaScript with Node. Of course, we're going to have a bigger demo at the end to kind of wrap everything up in a small package that you can have a finalized application so you can actually show somebody. So you can have it on GitHub and show, I don't know, your friends, hey, I actually created something with Node, and I can build upon that tomorrow when I need to create an application, maybe for an assignment or for school or whatever. Okay? So that's the final goal, is that you leave here with a finalized version of an application that you can show somebody. And that's very ambitious because we only have an hour or so for this. Okay? Okay. And because this is a workshop, you can feel free to give me feedback for stuff you understand, and feel free to just shout you're an idiot if you don't understand anything, just to get that point across. Okay, awesome. Let's go ahead and start very slowly with the basics and the overview of JavaScript. JavaScript as a language is not a programming language. You know what the difference is between a programming language and a scripting language? I know some of you must know this. What's the difference between the programming language and a scripting language? You don't? What do they teach you in what? What? Okay, just the bare bones. Programming language is a language that's compiled, that has a compiler that turns it into zeros, ones, or machine code or whatever. Okay? Scripting languages are just scripts. You give it the file, it executes the file, and once the file is executed, it just stops. JavaScript is a scripting language because you give it the file, it runs, and that's it. And that's what's happening with JavaScript in the web. you give the browser a file, it runs it, and it outputs something like this. You've all seen this, right? When you don't have internet? Yeah. So JavaScript was created by a guy named Brendan, and it was created in 10 days. So there are a lot of bugs in JavaScript because it wasn't intended to be a real language. Sadly, or good for us that it is. And it gives something called dynamism to the web. So everything that happens on the web that's dynamic, pressing buttons, animations, images flying around, whatever, loading new things with a button click or whatever, those are all things done with JavaScript. And that may seem like magic to you, but it's actually very real. Okay, so we know what JavaScript is. Let's talk a bit about Node. For JavaScript to work, you need a browser. That makes sense, right? But to write JavaScript on the server, there's something called an engine. And the creator of JavaScript, or sorry, Node.js, he took an engine from a browser and he put it on the server and made it run. So now you can take JavaScript code, put it in the Node engine, and run it. And it works perfectly fine. Cool, right? So now we have Node, and it enables us to write server-side JavaScript. So now we can write the same language on the front end and on the back end. And a really funny story, the inventor or the creator of JavaScript actually created this, or sorry, Node.js, he created it in his basement. So he's literally sitting in his basement, hating on everything because he doesn't like anything. And he was just, yeah, I'm going to create something better. And he literally did. Because the power of Node is because it's non-blocking execution. You know when you're writing something, maybe in C, you have some experience with C, and you come to like an execution of something, and you cannot continue that until it's finished because of something called threads. Okay? The problem with JavaScript is that like it only has one thread. So because it only has one thread, it will actually block everything until that execution is finished. But because we have asynchronous code in JavaScript, we can bypass this. And this is much faster than language such as Java or Python or whatever. Cool? Okay. Let's come back to the modules and frameworks. I mentioned that modules and frameworks are the basis of Node, and they can be the basis of Node because of something called the NPM registry. And I know you have some classes in like OS and operating systems, so whoever knows something about Linux knows that Linux has a registry for downloading things. Like Windows has too, I think, like the internet. And this is much easier for when you're building something, because why should you need to write a piece of code if somebody else has already written it? Why should you go through the pain of writing something for a week when you can just download something that's already done and use it, and that takes less than a day? And that's the fundamental like basis of using Node and using the NPM registry, because we do something called reduce, reuse, and recycle. And that's something you can do as well, because if you have an idea for a module of a piece of code that can do something, I don't know, maybe a login form or whatever, simple example, you can publish it to the registry and somebody else can use it. Your colleagues can use it. And that's the fundamental, like the basis of why we use Node and why it's awesome to use Node, because it makes development very easy. Does this make sense? Okay.
How do you handle multi-threaded events?
You don't.
Can you handle it?
You do it with asynchronous execution.
So there is a possibility asynchronously to do multi.
Exactly. Because we only use asynchronous non-blocking execution that simulates having multi-threaded execution. Okay.
Simulation.
Exactly. But the thing is that it's faster because it uses something called the event loop in JavaScript, in the engine itself. So it doesn't create new threads and then has to like oh, where did this thread go? I have to kill this thread, whatever. It just lists the asynchronous events on the loop, and they all get loaded when they need to get loaded. That's the thing. They don't lock anything. The only thing that gets on the main thread is when you call for it to execute. So it only executes beside the main thread. So you can imagine it like this. You have a river, right? And the river is the main thread. Make sense? When you get a call for an asynchronous function or an asynchronous execution, that's a branch of the main river. And you can have a little small side river beside the main one that doesn't have anything to do with the main one. And that can all finish up completely separate. And that's why the concept of having an event loop is very, very complicated, incredibly complicated. And I don't want to go into more detail, except for explaining the fact that it's totally separate, and you don't have to think about why it's separate. You just tell yourself, okay, I have an asynchronous execution of this piece of code. It will happen outside of this main thing, meaning that it will happen on a separate everything, like dimension, if we want to say dimension. It will happen totally different, totally separate, and then once it's done, it will just continue on the main.
Can it have impact on the main thread?
For sure, but it can have impact in the main thread if you do something called a callback or a promise or something like that, meaning that you have to tell the main thread, okay, once everything is done here, I want an event on the main thread to listen to this.
So it's event-based.
So it's only event-based. Does it make sense now? Like half of you are amazed and half of you are like, what the hell is it? So it's very complicated. To go into the nitty-gritty bits of how everything works is incredibly complicated. But if we just forget about all the complication and just say the main things about it's event-based, it's asynchronous, it simulates having multiple threads by being asynchronous. You have events that trigger when something is finished, so you can continue on a main thread, and that's it. Okay. And reduce, reuse, recycle, like live by this. If you have plastic bottles, recycle. If you have code that's redundant, that you don't need because somebody has written it already, reuse it, okay? Is this the next? Yep. If you have any more questions about this, go ahead and ask now. If not, we can go ahead with the demo, with the first example. Nope, nothing. Okay. Yep, let's go. So the first example will be very short, very to the point. We only want to do something called initialization of the NPM registry, meaning that we want to connect our application to the main registry so we can download modules. And with those downloaded modules for the basic things, we can create an application very easily. In order to actually use the modules, we need to install them. And by installing them means that we're downloading them from the registry and using them in our code, and using them in our source code. Make sense? Okay. And that's pretty much it. That's everything we need to write our own code and create a simple server with Node. And this simple server will actually do like nothing special. It will just run something on your local host and respond to an event. And the event we are going to use is just an HTTP request to like localhost / like the base route. Simple? You've had, yeah, you know basics about web, right? Like how you simulate the localhost server and all those things.
But there's also some students from first year who have not yet.
Awesome, great. Can you just wave who's in first year? Okay, you. Oh yeah, awesome. So do you have the? It doesn't matter if you're only the first year. If anybody here does not know what the local host is, I can just explain that real quick.
I know what.
You know what? Have you anybody else? Okay. Okay. Sure. Okay. So let's go ahead with the example then. Let me just and open the code. So I have an empty project in a code editor, totally empty. We're just going to use this empty project and a few commands to get everything set up. what we need to do first is we need to open up a terminal, and you do that. You can do it in, yeah, like this. Like this is super small. Let's not do it like this. OK, this is better, right? Yeah. So we'll just open up a terminal, and with one terminal command, you can download things from the registry. Just one note, because I think you're very intelligent individuals, you already know how to install Node on a machine, so I'm not going to install Node. I'm expecting that you can install Node yourself. And there's a bunch of tutorials for that, so you don't need me to show you. And once we have Node installed, just make sure it is installed. You can do node/v, and it's going to say version 8 something something, or whatever you choose on installing. And to make sure, once you install Node, you will have npm installed alongside. So if you actually do npm --version, it's to show the version of npm you have installed. And that's everything you need. You can now go ahead and just download and install stuff, whatever you want, from the registry. OK, so right now what we want to do is we want to do something called the command npm init. Can you see this? This is very tiny. Can you see this? OK. So once you do npm init, it will create something called a package.json file. And this package.json file is the main configuration file for your project. In the package.json, you have everything from the dependencies to the name to the description to everything you need for your project. OK? So once you do the npm init command, you're going to get a bunch of prompts for descriptions and whatever you want to do in your application. But we can just enter through this. Doesn't really, yeah, that's fine. So once you have that done, and you go back to the editor, you can see that you have a package.json file now. And we can just like this. So this file is the main manifest. We can say manifest. The main manifest for your project. Okay. And right now, it's pretty empty. You only have name, version, description, like the main key things you get. But after we do a couple of install commands, you're going to see this change. So after we have that, we need to go ahead and go back to the terminal. And here in the terminal now, we want to install a module. Meaning we want to install a module that's going to make our lives much easier for development, because it'll create, or actually give us the opportunity to create routes and create everything we need in our app very simply. It makes it very simple. So if we just go ahead and run the npm install express save, like this. This will grab a module called express, and it will save a reference for that module in the package.json file. So every next time you need to install this, you can just go ahead and install the packages from the file. So you don't have to name them by name in the terminal. You can just go ahead and type npm install, like this. And this is the common practice you use when you have, I don't know, you have 10 modules installed, and maybe you clone the repository on some other machine, or your friend clones it to his machine. He's not going to grab all the Node modules or all the modules you installed. He's just going to grab the package.json and then install it on his machine, because you don't have to throw around like 50 megabytes of code in modules. You just take the manifest that shows that you need those modules for your code to run. Okay? So this is very simple. Once we go back to the file here, right, to the editor, you can see that we now have something called node_modules, and it's a folder with a bunch of things in it. Meaning that once we ran this command, it's grabbed all the modules we need to run this express module. And this express module is just a framework, another word, framework, for creating applications very easily. So, and as you can see on the right side, we have dependencies and we have express right now. So this got added because we installed express as a module or as a package. You're following along, right? OK. So once we have that, we can go ahead and create a file. Let's go ahead and do just a simple app.js. Make sense? Yeah. So this is a simple JavaScript file. We can run whatever command in JavaScript in this file, and it'll work. It's incredibly simple. So if we want to just make sure it works, you can just type a simple console log and say, hello, BITA4Students, like this. Now, when we go back to the terminal, to run this file, we just say node and the name of the file. And it works. So we have now taken the file, interpreted it, and output the response to the terminal. Simple, like incredibly simple. So with this, we can actually create a whole app. Let me just, because I'm super lazy, I'm not going to write it. I'm just going to copy it over and show you like this. Okay, check this out now. So right now, does this code look familiar? Like, have you ever seen something that looks vaguely familiar to this? You have variables, you have like dot notation for methods, you have functions, all this looks fine, right? It's not magic, it's totally fine. And it really is that simple. You're using something called require, and that's something that's built into Node, like a default feature in Node, where you can grab a module you installed from the Node modules folder, load it, and pass it to a variable. Okay? So you're basically importing a module from the folder into a variable, and you're using that variable in your code. And that's what's happening here, because you're calling the require, you're passing it to a variable, you're creating an app from that main express module, and you're defining routes. You can see this app get. What do you think this app get does? Like just wild guess. What does get do?
Well, of course, getting the path from the HTTP request.
That makes sense. Do you agree with him, or? I see that you're agreeing, but you don't want to say that you're agreeing, just to make sure I'm not like screwing with you or anything. But just here's the logic. If we're doing a get, like a get method, that's actually an HTTP get method. So that's somebody typing in the URL this route and doing a get request for that resource. And what's happening is, because we defined a slash, that will be the root path. That makes more sense to say, root path. And as a response, here's the event we talked about now. As a response to this event, the root slash path, whatever, will be this function. So this function will be called when this event gets triggered. So we will see hello world get printed back once we hit this endpoint. Do you believe me? What do you think will happen? This kind of makes sense, right? Okay, let's see. So let's save this up. And again, run the file. And this got printed out to the terminal because we added the listening on port console log here, because we wanted the server to actually spin up on port 3000. So now when we go to the browser, let me just transfer over to the browser here, open up a that's it. Okay, so does this make sense now? We have a simple server created with Express that got run with Node. We're hitting the root path, and we're getting something returned back. Okay? You're following along so far, right? Okay. Okay, so do you have any questions about this before we move on, or is this okay? Okay, good. So we have now understood the fact of how we create a server and how we create paths and how we respond to those requests with some data. The data in our case now is just a hello world string. Okay. What we want to do now is to understand all the principles of what's going on and then create something for production. Before we can do that, we need to understand what an API is. Have you ever heard of this term, API? What do you think it means? But without reading? Maybe it's application programming. But just, I mean, think about this before you answer. So, you know it's an application program interface, okay? You know that. But what does it mean? Because application program interface is super complicated. Like, tell your father an application program interface.
I'd get slapped.
You'd get slapped. Yeah, that's a good point. So I mean, just think about it. What is in pure, like normal language? What does it mean to have an application program interface?
Set of instructions on how to use it.
That's a good answer. That's a really good answer. Anybody else? You're going to ask about events again, right? No. Okay. So this is a really good answer because we actually have a set of instructions that are abstracted away. Think about it a bit, because an application program interface means that you can do something and you can get the response back, but you don't know what's going on. You only care about what you give to the API and what you get back from the API. It's like a black box. It's quite literally like a black box. You have no idea what's going on inside. You just know that if you push this button, you will get something back. It's like buying coffee at the vendor machine or whatever. You put money in, you press a button, you get coffee out. You have no idea what's going on inside. Does this make sense now? So now again, what does really application program interface mean? With your own words, feel free. Not all at once.
Sending some requests and getting the results back without knowing what's going on.
That's also a very good example. Okay, so we're learning not something. Yay! Good. So I'm just to mention this as well. When I say API and when I say endpoint, that's most likely the same thing. I'm thinking about the same thing, and that will be just a URL. Just a URL that points to some resource. That's like slash something or whatever, localhost 3000 slash hello or something like that. Okay. So just so you know, so you're all on the same page. Okay, this makes sense. Great. So we have that down. We know what an API is. But now when we're creating applications, this sample we created just recently, it doesn't have a database. It doesn't have anything for persisting data. You have knowledge about databases, right? Okay. If somebody hasn't, please like just. Okay, good. So using databases is very complicated, especially when you're using databases with applications such as Node or Java or whatever. You need to have a way of telling the application what kind of structure of data the database wants. Otherwise, it's just going to get jumbled all together. So you want to have a structure of how you should send data to the database. And that's something you do with ORMs. And ORMs are short for Object Relational Mapper. And just by the name of Object Relational Mapper, it kind of makes sense what it does, because it's mapping objects that are relational, kind of. So if you think about it like that, if you have a SQL database, simple SQL database, you know about SQL, right? Okay, so you have a really simple SQL database with, I don't know, 3 tables. And you have one object that needs to get inserted to the database. But that one object has a bunch of different fields that fit into all 3 databases. That's a problem, because you have to parse the data, create 3 objects, then insert them one by one, and then do a bunch of complicated things that you really don't want to do because, I mean, we're people, we make mistakes. We're going to screw something up and it's going to be bad. That's why we have something called ORMs, because ORMs will do that for us. With ORMs, we define the structure of the data we want, and we let the ORM make sure that the database only accepts that type of data. Does that make sense? Okay. And it's called a mapper because it quite literally maps the data to make sure it adheres to the principles we set. It makes sure that the data you send will be in that format so it will fit in the database correctly. Okay. And because in the example after this, we'll be using a NoSQL database. You know about NoSQL, right? Like Mongo and JSON storage. I'm sure there was a BitAlijansa talk, I think it was yesterday or the day before, about NoSQL, so you can check that out. But the problem with NoSQL is because you don't have a set structure in the database. You can pretty much insert whatever you want into the database. And that's an issue because you want to have a structure that's coherent. You want to have something that's kind of the same. And that's why you use an ORM to make sure that the data you send will be in the correct format. Okay? Starting to make sense now, right? Okay, so we have all the basics done and understood for both APIs and ORMs, for all the tools we're going to be using of how to send data to an API, what the API does, how the API will handle the response, and how to actually insert or get or whatever the data from the database. So after we have all that done, we understand that what we need, what tools we need to understand the basic patterns and paradigms of how to get this done. And to understand this is actually very complicated in JavaScript because JavaScript as a language is both object-oriented and functional. Okay, so you know about object-oriented programming with classes, objects, and creating methods for objects and properties for objects, etc. You know about that, right? That's what we did with the app. We had an app get, that's a method for an object, and we're calling something with that method. Simple. And that's the object-oriented nature of JavaScript. But the other nature of JavaScript is functional because every function you have is a value like any other. So if you have a string value and a function value, they're all viewed the same. So you can pass around a function the same way you would pass around a string. And that's very complicated to understand if you're doing object-oriented programming, because that means you can pass a function into a function into a function, etc. as a parameter. And that's what? That's incredibly complicated to understand. But we're gonna try and understand this very simply by doing not complex examples at all, and it's going to be really, really okay for you to understand. And what else I wanted to mention with this like really fancy Venn diagram I took like 7 minutes to create is that we have something called model view controller. And model view controller is the essential design pattern or architectural pattern or whatever we want to call it. It's a pattern we use to create robust applications where we know where everything is, how we handle every part of our application. Because with MVC, we can do something called separation of concerns, meaning that we have one file for handling the logic, we have one file for handling storage in the database, we have another file for doing whatever else we need. For example, showing a view, showing some data or whatever. So we're separating the concerns, so we have multiple files to handle multiple logical things. And that makes perfect sense because you don't ever want to have one file with everything in it, because you're going to end up with a file that's 1,000 lines huge, and nobody's going to like you for writing a file that's 1,000 lines huge, right? So don't write huge files. And yeah, last thing, this is where we want to be, like in the center here, because we want to have everything just enough so it makes sense. What we're doing now is very simply we're going to take all the things we talked about now, about MVC, about object-oriented and functional programming, and all the modules I mentioned, we're going to first install some new modules to make it more easy to connect the database and all those things. And we're going to utilize the MVC pattern of creating an application. So we're going to have separate files for all the separate logical structures we need, and that's going to make it very easy to create our final project. So first of all, we're going to start really slowly by first installing things we need. And the main things we need are 2 more modules. Let's just stop this. And there are 2 more modules that are about the database connection and the parsing of incoming requests and incoming data. And it's actually pretty simple. Let's just switch over to here we go. And that's pretty simple. We just want to go ahead and install something called Mongoose, and that's an ORM. I mentioned ORMs just now. That's an ORM for Mongo, like the Mongo database. That's a NoSQL database we're going to be using. And apart from that, we also want to install something called body-parser, and that's just a module for parsing incoming and outgoing requests, or HTTP requests, because we want to take the JSON data we send to an HTTP request, parse it, so we have it neatly formatted in our code. And body parser does that for us. So after we run this, both Mongoose and body parser will get added to our package JSON file, and they will get downloaded to the the Node modules folder. So right now, we can switch back to the code. And what we want to do in the code is, let's go ahead and start really simple. First of all, we want to require all the things we need, and then go ahead and add a database connection. So these are the main things we need right now. We want to grab Express. We want to initialize an app with Express. We want to require the body parser, and we want to initialize the body parser module. And those are all just the basic things you need to do once you're creating a new project. And once we have all of that done, we want to create a new file. And this new file will be for the database connection. And we're going to use Mongoose as the ORM to connect to the database. And that's very simple. Let's just add a new file, name it db.js. And in this file, we just want to add the connection. And you add the connection fairly simply. You just do it like this. You, again, require Mongoose, require the ORM, and you say, Mongoose, go ahead and connect on this URL. So on this URL is where my Mongo database is located. And it's exactly the same if you want to use a SQL database. You can install a SQL ORM, connect it in the same way. It's very similar whichever ORM you use. So if you learn this one way, it's going to be exactly the same for every other. OK, so once we have this, sorry? OK. Once we have this, we can go ahead and take this database file and require it in our main app.js file. So we can go ahead and say, require. Cool. We can go ahead and require and add the reference for that file. So it's like this. Oh, nope, not like that, like this. OK. So once we require this file, this means that once we run the app.js file, and it comes to line number 7 here, it's going to open up and run this db.js file. And because it's running this file, it's not going to continue on line 8 until this is finished running. So we're going to have the database connection created here in the DB file. Awesome. So what else we need to do is we need to add a line of code to tell the server to start listening. And there we go. So with app listen and with passing the port here, we're going to tell the Express server to start listening on localhost port 3000. So this means that if we run this, we will have a successful database connection. So that's good. Once we have that, what do you think is next? Just to stop here, what do you think will be the next step after we have the basic server set up and the basic database connection set up? What do we need to do now? Like, what's the next step for creating? What do we want to create? That's the question. Yeah, so we want to create routes. We want to create events to which to respond with functions. Simple. So a way we can do this is we can first take a really simple example and just add it here after the required DV. We can say, okay, app get on the route called API. I want a function. This is just a shorthand, like a easier way of writing a function with the arrow here. Can you guys see the arrow? Yeah, so it's just a shorthand for writing functions. So this is exactly the same. Oh, nope, not that. This is exactly the same as this. Okay? And yeah, let's leave it like this because it's prettier. So now, once we go to the API route, we're going to get this response of the status 200, and we're going to send back API works. Does this make sense? Just to make sure that you're all following this, we can go back to the terminal and go ahead and run the Node application once again. And once we have that, and turn back to the browser, where are you? There you are. We can go ahead and run this once again on the route API, and it'll say API works. Okay, so we have a route finished. We have a database connection. We have the basic server set up. So now we need to create the actual endpoint we're going to use. So we need to create something that's going to be inserted to the database so we can then retrieve it or get it back from the database. So the standard example of doing this, very simple example, is like with doing notes, because I mean, notes examples and samples are, I mean, you're always going to find a sample with notes because it's really easy to understand. So just to follow that, we're going to do the same. We're going to take, if I can just open it, we're going to take a simple logical structure of having notes, of adding and retrieving notes from a database and creating that in our Express app. So the way we can do this is rather simple. First of all, I like to do something called separation of concerns, where if I'm going to create a new feature, and this notes, adding, deleting, or whatever, it's a new feature. So I like to create something like this. I create a new folder that's named as the feature I want to create. So if I create a folder named Note, I want to go ahead and create a file in this that's called the Node.js. And why did I name it Node.js? Well, because I want to create a model. And remember when I mentioned ORMs, how we structure the data with the ORM to be the way we want to put it to the database or to insert it to the database? We do this with models. So this Node.js file will be our model. We will use the ORM to define the structure of the model, and based on this, insert it to the database. So a really simple way of showing a model will be like this. Let me just, because I'm going to name it with a small n, because making it all small capital letters is JavaScript. Okay, so we have a small Node.js file, and what we want to do is we want to insert the logic for our model. Is this formatted right? Yes, it is. So here, in this piece of code, why is this so impossible to? Okay, like this. Yep, here it is. So here, as you can see, we have required mongoose. So that's the ORM. We're taking the ORM, we're telling it, okay, create a schema, create a model that's named node schema. And inside, we want to have a title, description, and a pinned field. And that's everything we want. So everything we're adding to the database can only have this structure. If we want to add a note into our database, it has to be in this structure. So it will only take these values. Make sense? And they will be string, string, and a Boolean. You know what strings and Booleans are? Yeah. Awesome. And what we're doing in the end is something called module exports. And this is a new thing you're just seeing right now. And this is what the require function is grabbing. Because if you're doing a require, you're basically grabbing the module exports of another file. Does this make sense? It's like a return value in a function. You know return values in functions? How when you're returning something, you're throwing it back from the function. Exactly the same logic is going on here. You're having a value, the Mongoose model, and you're exporting it from this file. So why are we doing this? Because we want to use this Mongoose model to insert things and to retrieve things from our database. And they will always be in this structure. Does this make sense? OK. So once we have the model done and saved up, now we can switch to, or actually create a new file that will be a controller. So let's go ahead and add a new file that will be note.controller.js, like this. And in this controller, what do you think is happening in a controller? Just from the top of your head, what do you think is going on in a controller? If we have the model in the Node file, what do we have in the controller file? Just think about this. 5 more seconds. Think about it. Anybody? You want a hint or some help? If we have the structure in one file, what do we want to have in the controller file?
Something that can hold the structure and show it to the view, or do something to eventually.
Can actually do some logic and can take that model and do something with it, return something or insert something. So all the logic we want to write is going on in the controller. Because it's a controller, right? It controls stuff. So even the names are pretty sensible. Okay, so let's go ahead and start pretty simple with this one. In the controller, we want to require express once again, and we want to create something called a router from the express object. And this router will only handle routes as in slash or slash API or whatever we want to do. And that's everything we need here. Once we have that, we can go ahead and add the model. So we want a Node model, and we would just require, the .note file, like this. So right now, you see the require here? We're grabbing everything from module exports in this file, everything here. We're grabbing all of this and putting it here. Makes sense? So now we can go ahead and use this ORM, this note, to add things, to retrieve things, to update things, or whatever we want to do in the database. And let's show how you do that. And I mean, I can even type it out. So we reference the node controller. We say post, and I want to post to the root, like this. And once I post to the root, I want to create a function that's asynchronous. And I'm going to explain in a second why it's asynchronous. Can I say, yep. Like so. And I want to have a function respond to this event. OK. And why do I want to have a function to respond to this event? Well, simple. I want to do something called insert or create for the database. So I want to use this ORM to create a note. And the note will be in this body parameter sent to this post request. So I'm going to send something in a post request, HTTP post request. Understand that? We're sending that to this root parameter. That's going to get put in the request body. That's going to be created in the database. And the response of that creation is what we send back to the client. Make sense? OK. And now, because this is all great, we also need a way of getting this. So we can just go ahead and do the same thing, but a GET request also for the slash, and we want to do a async function for getting everything like this. Okay, can you see this? Is this visible enough? I think it's fine. So what's going on now? We have another function for getting the notes, and we have one for adding a note. So these are two functions responding to two different HTTP requests to the same path. Just take a few seconds just to let this sink in. Okay, does this make logically sense? Can it make sense what we're doing? Awesome. Finally, we also have to export out the controller so we can require it in the main file, because we want to load it in our main app.js file. And we do that also pretty simply by just doing this. Let me show you. We can save this up and switch back to the app file. And right underneath the API, let's just add these two lines here. We have required the controller, and we're using the controller as the route API nodes. So right now, everything that's going on is that when you do a post request to API nodes and send it some JSON object, it will add that to the database and send you back what it added. Simple. If you do a GET request to API nodes, it will just fetch all the things you have in the database. Make sense? Now let's try it out and see how it works. I'll just like this and like this. And for testing this out, let's not use the browser. Let's use this simple tool. And what I'm going to do is use this one. Yep, this one. And what you see here is I'm sending a post request to localhost 3000 API nodes. And this is the JSON body I'm sending along. So this is the data I'm sending along that will get passed to the function and get added to the ORM or the node.create method. And what we should see get sent back to us is the response from the database, or actually the object that was created in the database. Oh. Well, that was not good. Does anybody have an idea why it doesn't work?
Maybe because upper web.
Sorry?
Because upper web.
We can check again.
Can you go back to Node.js?
Yep. Maybe I forgot to save something. That's also an issue. If you forget to save something, it won't load the file right. That makes sense. Let's try it again. Okay, let's try it again. Yep. And again, and Yep, now it works. So note to self, always save your files before running. And yeah, that's pretty much it. Now, because we added those two fields, it has added the title and the description just as we wanted. And if we try to add something that's not a title or a description, it just won't add it to the database, because it will only add the things we defined in the model. Because the ORM works like that. You define what you want, and you filter out all the rest. OK, so just to make sure this also works for the GET request, let's run that as well. I think you run that. Let's run the GET request again and see how that works. Yep, we have a list of a couple of nodes we added just now. So, and as you can see, this is very simple. There's very little moving parts here. There's nothing going on that's magical. You know you have an API, you have a route, you have a function that's responding to that route, and that's it. It's all events. And it's all asynchronous. So many of these things can happen quite literally in parallel, because they get created as separate responses to events. And once they're finished, they're just finished. And that's super simple and very easy to get your head around. So you don't have to think about threads. You don't have to think about any of those complicated things. Yep. Do you have any more questions about this, or should we move on? Yeah, OK. Netto. Yep. So let's just do a quick recap of everything we learned today. The main things we learned are about JavaScript, what it is, how it works. We learned about Node, that it's a framework for writing JavaScript on the back end, and how it's focused on modules and frameworks. We actually also learned how to use and install modules. So now you know how to use NPM for your projects, and that's the main thing for writing Node applications. You know how to write APIs. You know what ORMs are. So now you can actually store some data in a database and in a real application without just playing around with Hello World. So that's a great thing. And of course, you know the basics of design patterns and of paradigms in JavaScript. So now you know that you have both object-oriented programming and functional programming, and that you should use MVC for the basic things when you're writing JavaScript code, because it just makes things much more easy when you have dedicated files for dedicated logical things in your app. And that's pretty much everything we learned today. I hope you weren't too bored listening to the presentation. And if you have any questions right now, you can have a Q&A session for like 5 or 10 minutes, as long as you want. Any random question you had throughout the presentation, you can go ahead. If not, I'm available on pretty much any of the social medias except for Facebook, because delete Facebook, yes. But you can message me wherever, and I have the same handle or even email, so you can just go ahead and send there.